And I think we too often get distracted by this search for the right answer without realizing that all that matters is your answer, and there is no right answer.
Hey there, I'm Goli Kalkaran, and this is Lessons from a Quitter, where we believe that it's never too late to start over. No matter how much time or money you've spent getting to where you are, if ultimately you are not happy, then it's time to get out. If you're feeling stuck and you feel like there's gotta be more, there's gotta be a way to feel fulfilled and excited about what you do, then this is the podcast for you. Each week, I will sit down with an inspiring guest who quit their professional career in order to forge their own path and create a life that they love. Hello, welcome back. Thank you so much for joining me. And if you're new here, welcome. I really appreciate you tuning in. If you like the podcast and you want more, you want some help, getting unstuck from something that you want to quit, go to the website and sign up for our newsletter at lessonsfromaquitter.com. It's a weekly newsletter where I send out an article or a video that is meant to teach you something, whether it's focused on overcoming fear or how to spot your own biases and things like that. It's a super short newsletter that, like I said, will just teach you something every week. And who doesn't want to learn? So go to the website and sign up for that. And actually, it is on a topic that really relates to today's guest. And I sent out his TED Talk this morning in that newsletter, which I would recommend everybody Google and listen, or you can find it in the show notes from today's episode. Today, we have Isaac Lidsky on the show, and I cannot tell you how honored I am that he came to speak with me today. He honestly has one of the most eclectic and incredible resumes that I have ever seen. I was planning for this interview, and I didn't know how to approach it because there's just so much to cover. Just to give you a little more background about everything that he's accomplished in his short life so far, he was the series regular Weasel on Saved by the Bell, the new class. He decided to leave acting after being a child actor, and he went to Harvard at the age of 16. He graduated at 19, cum laude, in mathematics and computer science. He then went on to found a tech startup after college, but left quickly to go back to law school at Harvard Law. He clerked for not one, but two Supreme Court justices, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor and Justice Ginsburg. He went on from there to become a Justice Department litigator, where he never lost a case. And after that, he went to an elite international law firm where he was presumably making multiple six figures. And he decided that he wasn't happy as a lawyer and he wanted to be more of an entrepreneur. And so with his friend, he bought a small construction company because he correctly predicted that in 2011 that the housing market was inevitably going to recover and that it would demand a far more efficient construction model. And so he buys this company that turns out to be doing a lot worse than he had thought. And it looks as though he's going to lose everything. And he somehow turns it around and grows that company tenfold in its first 5 years. And today it boasts annual revenues in excess of $250 million. But that's not all. He also founded Hope for Vision, a nonprofit that funds the development of treatments and cures for blinding diseases. And I guess I should mention this now, that at the age of 13, he was diagnosed with a rare genetic disease that deteriorated his eyesight and would make him go blind. He eventually went blind by the age of 25. So he did all of this with what most people would consider, quote unquote, a disability. And his TED Talk and his book, Eyes Wide Open, are all about the fact that this disease and his subsequent blindness fundamentally changed his perspective and allowed him to live a more fulfilled life and to really understand how fear tricks our mind into thinking that our reality is objective when in reality it's not. We just created it and we control it. We can use that control and to create the life that we want. He's unbelievably inspiring and there's a lot to cover. So I will stop rambling and let Isaac do more of the speaking. So let's jump right in. Hi, Isaac. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me.
I'm so excited to get into your long and incredible resume and talk about kind of the journey that you've taken. So I want to start at the beginning. I don't want to spend a ton of time. I'm sure a lot of people are super interested in your stint in Hollywood as Weasel on Saved by the Bell. I don't want to talk that much about that experience. I am interested though, you grew up as a child actor and you clearly gained some success. And a lot of people, when they have that taste, when you were saying in your book, you get to go to these parties and be in the magazines and people want autographs, like that is very intoxicating. And so what was it that made you leave that? Like once Saved by the Bell didn't work out, why not continue down that road? Why did you decide I'm going to go to college instead?
Well, a few things. So I moved out to Los Angeles to do a sitcom right around the time that I was diagnosed with my blinding disease. So, I guess sort of a tad bit more on my mind than the average sort of 13 or 14-year-old. So
right.
I think maybe in some respects I was sort of thinking bigger picture. Also, the fan mail, the celebrity, that stuff was definitely fun and it was an amazing experience.
Mm-hmm.
I feel blessed to have had it, but it never felt super comfortable to me. It never sat very well with me. I remember finding it odd that, because I did this sort of somewhat lame Saturday morning TV show, there was this desire by, for people to sort of recognize me or picture with me or sign an autograph. And that just always struck me as very odd and nonsensical. So it wasn't hard for me to sort of leave that behind, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And you just mentioned that you were diagnosed around that time. And you talk a lot about this in your book and as well, like kind of your TED Talk. Can you tell us a little bit about that time, knowing, especially with this kind of a disease where it's not like you're instantly blind and then you have to deal with it. It's sort of the anticipation of it's going to happen, but you don't know when. And it's already a hard time, I feel like, at teenage years for a child. And so can you tell us a little bit about what you dealt with, kind of knowing that this is happening in your future?
Sure. So though at the time it was challenging and difficult and painful, in retrospect, I'm able to appreciate that I was sort of given a very diverse range of experiences, all with this sort of experience of mine losing my sight. When I was diagnosed, I was 13, and I happened to be diagnosed because one of my older siblings had sight issues. At the time, I would have said that I saw, quote unquote, perfectly or normally. I certainly would not have thought for a second that I saw any worse than my peers. So the first sort of phase of it all was just truly this sort of future prospect, right? This sort of future foreboding, this doom and gloom, and trying to process it sort of in the abstract. It wasn't that long, maybe a couple of years or a few years before some of the symptoms were a lot more frequent and a lot more noticeable.
Mm-hmm.
Naturally, I was on the lookout for them. So that kind of began the sort of the chapter of sort of slowly, progressively losing my sight, which was a journey in and of itself. And then kind of towards the end of that, was able to, with support of friends and family, kind of make that leap into accepting and embracing my life sort of as a blind man. And that's sort of been the last chapter, if that makes any sense.
I would encourage everybody to check out your TED Talk and to read your book. But you talk a lot about that losing your sight was a blessing in your life and that it made you see with eyes wide open, which is the title of your book. Can you explain to us a little bit what you mean by that, like what it is to see with eyes wide open?
Sure. Literally, the experience that I had losing my sight over about a dozen years is what gave me sort of profound insight into the way the human mind works. And sort of what I mean by that is the human experience of sight is meant to be, when everything's working, it's this sort of magical illusion where, you feel like you open your eyes and you're opening a window, right? The world is there, it's objective, it's truth, it's something beyond you and you are perceiving it. Because of the sort of bizarre effects that my disease produced as I slowly lost my sight, I literally got to experience, how far from true that is. To the contrary, really is this total concoction of the mind. It's brilliant, but it's completely made up. And it involves who you are, what you're thinking, your memories, opinions, emotions, all this stuff about it, about who you are in any moment kind of defines your sight. In fact, it's really only about 10% information from the eyes, 90% other stuff. So to me, I remember how stark that contradiction is. It struck me, even at the time, even as I was seeing it, it struck me that like, man, we literally create this experience of sight, but then we experience it as like some objective truth. Like we are literally creating our own reality. Later, I was able to see the real gift in that, because just one way that we do that, this largely defines the human experience, is it's living a reality you create for yourself. So the sort of aha moment for me really was when I realized that the same way I had taken sight for granted as this sort of external reality, really that's the way fear was operating in my life. That a lot of the awful, horrible things I told myself, lies really, that I told myself about how my life was going to turn out because of blindness, I was experiencing those things as truth, just like sight. When I really got down to it, I was able to see that, again, it was really just a creation of my own mind. And if I wanted to make a different choice for myself, if I wanted to take control over the reality I was creating for myself, and with intention and purpose and awareness, sort of actively decide what kind of life I wanted to live, I could do that too. And I'd like to think I'm living proof of that. I certainly feel I live a life that's overwhelmed with blessings and a lot of joy.
I love that you say that. I mean, that's a constant theme that comes up on this podcast. And it's interesting to talk to people where I feel like, dismiss the fact that you can just change your perspective on things, and the way you think about things is literally what ends up like creating your reality. And I think it's easier to think like, no, what happens to you is your life, is not how you kind of react to it. And I think we try to show that in the people that we talk to, and the fact that it seems so simple, but it really is. I mean, it's hard to do. I think it's a constant process, but it is as simple as like, if you change, like you're just saying, there's so much, not only just neuroscientific studies that show, like if you think that you're lucky, you end up seeing more opportunities. And then that just reinforces the fact that you are lucky, whereas if you think you're unlucky, and all these different things. And I love your perspective, both in the book. I think you summarize it so well and give such great examples to the fact that it really isn't an objective reality. It is colored by all of our experiences and our emotions. And like you said, I mean, a large part, fear. I think fear has a very controlling presence in a lot of people's minds, and that keeps them stuck in, I guess, safe but unhappy situations.
Yeah. I mean, fear is an important and primal motivator for us, and obviously serves a great function, but it's not all that helpful in helping us sort of manifest our higher selves and express who we want to be and how we want to live. And so I agree with you that fear is a particularly pernicious, and it's also, we're living in remarkably fearful times.
Yeah.
And so for both of those reasons, I do think, and I urge your listeners to consider investing in some thought about fear and how it motivates us.
Yeah. I mean, can you talk a little bit, because you do talk in your book a lot about how fear replaces the unknown with awful. It creates whatever void of you not knowing what's going to happen with always the worst. And you lead that into talking about this critic that we all have in ourselves. Can you talk a little bit about like how that critic keeps us in this state of fear?
I am convinced that sort of much of life, or the mastery of one's own life, is really about perspective, right? And how you sort of tuning in the right perspective, with which to confront the situation. But so to me, sort of this notion of sort of fear's tunnel versus sort of the critic's lofty perspective, really, sort of opposite ends of a sort of perspective. So at the risk of rambling on and on and on, we're wired to predict, to infer, to assume, right? Like the way our human mind works is we build up vast databases of experiences, and we reason from our past experiences. And that's how we literally wired to assume.
Right.
Fear is something that shows up most intensely when we confront, for which there's no data in the database, right? It's unknown, often in times of crisis, but it can even just be times of great change. Fear is essentially your mind doing its best to fill in the gaps, notwithstanding any basis for judgment. So fear says, I'll take the unknown, which is what I cannot abide, and I will replace it with the awful, the worst, the darkest of imagining. If you're not careful, if you don't sort of catch fear in the act, so to speak, you buy it and then you make it your reality. And that's a real shame. I feel that I personally came very, very close to letting my fear dictate the reality of my life as a blind man. Again, I feel very lucky that I was able to see through that. And that's ultimately what has motivated me to want to write the book and talk about it and share my experience.
Yeah. And let's talk about your experience, because I mean, when you were saying came close, and it clearly didn't stop you, because you went on to go to college at Harvard at 16 and graduated at 19, then went to Harvard Law School a little bit later, and you clerked for 2 Supreme Court justices, which for, the non-lawyers, I know the lawyers that tend to listen to this podcast will understand like how incredible that is. But for the non-lawyers, I mean, it is the most prestigious job. It is so difficult to get those positions. It is like, I don't even know the percentage, but probably 0.001% of lawyers would ever get that experience. So to be able to clerk for not 1, but 2 justices, and then work as a Justice Department lawyer, you went on to have an incredible career with the Justice Department. and then move on to a prestigious international law firm, which all is amazing. But the title of this podcast and our focus is people that have quit and have kind of chosen a different path and that journey. You have this incredibly impressive resume that can open up doors to lead you into very high positions that I think a lot of lawyers would only dream of. And you decide to quit law and buy a construction company. So walk us through like how that decision happens. Like what made you decide to leave law when you were at the firm?
As you said, I had several phenomenal experiences in law that were just among the greatest experiences of my life. Ultimately, I wound up, working for a big international law firm, though for some that can be a great path. For me, I didn't enjoy it at all. It was just the wrong fit for me. Meanwhile, around this time, my wife and I, Dorothy and I, are living in London and then Manhattan, and she conceives and then gives birth to our triplets. Now in Manhattan with newborn triplets, it was a high risk and sort of a complex, very stressful time even before they were born. And then they spent 70 days in total in the neonatal intensive care unit. So suffice it to say, there was a 100-day, a very intense period for me and my family around all this time going on. And, I really came out of that period understanding that I was going to listen to my heart and what was important to me at the time. Above all else was wanting to spend as much time as I could with my children, with my wife, wanting to do a job, frankly, that I could be good about without reservation and explain to my kids and that kind of thing. I got to talking to one of my closest friends in the world, one of my college roommates, a guy named Zach Merriman. He said to me, why don't we, if we can't buy a small business together, you can run it. We'll have a company together and hopefully, make a nice income for you. And if we do real well, a little extra, and, away we go. And I remember being struck by how generous the offer was and what it implied in terms of his faith in me. And the other thing I remember thinking was I'm going to approach this from the perspective of why not, not from the perspective of why. I didn't have any good reasons why not. So we did it.
That's incredible, though. I mean, to say that you had that perspective, I think is just an incredible perspective to have that most people can't get themselves. When you say you couldn't think of why not, I'm assuming that most people, when they have triplets at home, and at the time, was your wife working or was she at home?
No.
Okay. So you guys are on your income, which I'm assuming at a prestigious law firm, you're making multiple six figures. And so I think that's the only why not they find is, I have to be secure. I have to provide for my wife and 3 children. And I'm going to take this risk of buying a small business. Had you ever run a business before?
Sort of, not really. I did an internet advertising startup in 1999 and did that for a few years, but that's a very different type of business than a residential construction company.
Right. So that's what I mean. I mean, I think that's an incredible thing to say, I'm just going to go for it.
Here's the problem. To me, I definitely see you want to provide for your family and you need to make an income and all those. I don't mean to totally disregard the fact that, definitely took some substantial risk and, we put our life savings into the business and all that. To me, you got to start with a question of like, what is important to you? And who do you want to be? How do you want to spend your time? What kind of father do you want to be? Spouse? What kind of child do you want to be? What kind of partner do you want to be? Et cetera, et cetera. So I saw early in my life, again, as I've explained, this blessing of blindness in my life, so to speak, I saw that whether we like it or not, whether we believe it or not, in every moment, we are choosing who we are and how we want to live our life. So once you see that and you answer the questions for yourselves, who do I want to be? What kind of dad do I want to be? How do I want to live my life? What does a career look like for me? Then it's just clear enough. You've got to make a change. So, I had to make a change and I had to do it quickly. And Zach's offer sure as heck seemed like a great one.
Yeah.
So we did it.
Really, it comes down to that. And that's sort of why I'm harping on it, because so many times when I talk to people that hate what they're doing or they're stuck in these big law firms or whatever career it is, and they don't want to be in there. And you were talking about in your book, you talk about awfulizing, which like making the fear of the unknown makes everything awful. And it really is as simple as you're saying it. And, and I agree with you wholeheartedly. I just think that the fear takes over and we create every excuse. When it comes down to it, it's what do you want to be doing? And if this isn't what you want to be doing, then do something else. But it's so much in practice, it seems that we can't get to that point.
I completely agree with you. Let's talk about fear. To me, take us that moment when you're honest with yourself and you say, geez, I'm not living my priorities or my life's not looking the way I want it to look like. And there's changes I want to make and things like that. And ask, what are you afraid of? To me, it would be a far greater shame. Perhaps a greater fear would be to say, you're going to look up in 10 years realize you feel the same way, have felt the same way for 10 years and have done nothing about it. Like, that's what I would be terrified of.
Absolutely. I think that is, 100% the reality. Unfortunately, we don't tend to have the perspective of that. A lot of times we sit in what we're in now and we don't think about, well, I'm going to work for another 30 years or 35 years or whatever it is. And I don't want to be doing this. So I should make a change now, but it's kind of like putting it off. So no, I couldn't agree more. So now, when you buy a construction company, did you have any experience in construction or?
No.
Perfect.
Yeah. So, thesis was the end of 2010, beginning of 11, you had the residential new home construction industry was, at a once in a lifetime low, right? A historic anomaly, right? After the housing crisis. And so we figured that with this humble residential construction subcontractor in Orlando, we could sort of buy some exposure to this market as it was recovering. We thought it inevitably would recover. And so away we go. So that was the thesis. It seemed like a good enough idea at the time. We got to know the business and the owner and his fellow, a lot of the team. Mm-hmm. And away we went. And, we sailed off with the greatest of intentions and joyful spirits. So I don't regret that. Turned out to have been a disastrous purchase. We had a lot to learn about sort of due diligence and how to really thoroughly assess a business. A lot of the information we got was sort of garbage in, garbage out. Mm-hmm. But anyway, however we got there, it turned out we were hemorrhaging money from day one, which was not the plan. I want to stress. But anyway, that's another story.
That's what people say, like, see, that's what my fear is. That is the fear actualizing, right? So the fear is I don't know what I'm doing. And if I'm going to buy this company and then I'm going to have a company that is worse off than I thought or is failing. And now I've left this career. I mean, at the time when you realized once you bought the company and it's hemorrhaging money and it's a lot worse, did you think like, God, I can't believe I left my job? Like, why did I do this?
Okay, so I will answer that question. But first, as a disclaimer, I am not suggesting that everybody out there should be a bet it all entrepreneur over and over again in their lives. That's who I am. I mean, I love it. I'm an entrepreneur at heart. I love to build things from scratch. Frankly, I get bored pretty quickly. And, that's who I am. If you're miserable at work and what you want to be doing is, painting birds, figure out some way to paint birds.
Right.
I mean, your life is going by. I'm not saying everyone should buy a construction company, but in my case, that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to build something. I wanted to try to inspire a group of people to do something excellent and sort of come together. So to answer your question, yes, I thought I was just a monumental fool. Yes, I gave myself a very hard time, but also really largely with the help of my wife, Dorothy. Dorothy helped me to see the only thing I need to focus on was productively solving the problem. And we could save all the other stuff for later once we solved the problem. And then, my mom came through with an incredibly generous support. Anyway, it's a whole long story, but ultimately it became, exactly what I wanted, right? The challenge of building this business and a team and solving problems and doing it. And so that was the journey that I ultimately, was signing up for and I wanted. So that's what we did.
Yeah. And I mean, you gloss over it again, you go through it a lot more in your book. And I think everybody should absolutely read it because I think bad the situation was, like you were mentioning that you were considering filing for bankruptcy and you guys figured that you'd have to basically close down the company and then your mother offered you her life savings, which again is a very difficult decision, once it's already kind of failing when you think about the risk of like what happens if you lose that money or whatnot. And so to take that and then you've turned it around and it's not just like turning it around. You guys have grown an incredible company. I saw on your website that you were saying you're now making, I don't know, 250 million in revenue. And I'm assuming you're employing, I don't know, hundreds and hundreds of people.
Those are both fair assumptions.
That's an incredible turnaround. It's not like, oh yeah, we just, it clearly, you talk in your book about not only the critic, but the strong man that we all have in our inside of you. And one of the things that I loved about that interview that you talked about is that you talk about like, if you make a decision and then you fail at it, then the critic comes out and destroys you and says like, see, you were never good. You don't know what you're doing. But if you end up being a success, then you can kind of drink your own Kool-Aid and think like, oh, I'm so great. But neither one of those things can be true. Like the decision was the decision. You made that regardless without knowing the outcome.
Yes.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little more about how that affects you?
This is one of these logical fallacies that we humans tend to make all the time. And I think there are just huge stakes involved. And so thanks for the opportunity to ramble on about it. But So Gosh, we have this when we confront these momentous decisions in our lives, personal or professional, buy the business or not, merger or not, marry the guy or not, propose or not, whatever. There are obviously these weighted moments, and there's fear and there's anxiety. And for whatever reason, I kind of feel like that wiring in the brain that codifies that experience kind of stays open until at some point we kind of convince ourselves of some judgment as to whether we did the right thing or the wrong thing. Was it a success or not? Were we smart or dumb? Was it, whatever, wise or foolish? And at that point, we kind of want to go back and close the loop on the quality of our decision at the time it was made. And that just doesn't make any sense at all. We know, assuming we can all agree that we do not control everything. No one person controls everything, right? We live in a world with other people, with forces beyond our control, et cetera, et cetera. We make our best decisions when we make them, and then life happens. And so I think we do ourselves a really great disservice when we compound unfortunate failure with misbelieving that the entire enterprise was doomed. Probably worse is when we convince ourselves that we're really brilliant.
Right.
When foolhardy decisions work out.
Right.
I largely view, not my business, I'm immensely proud of ODC and the team. I largely view sort of Zach and my decision to buy ODC as a foolhardy decision that blessedly turned out very well.
Right. And do you think that your decision to leave the law to start this company, I don't know, for lack of a better term, not like it's easier, but the fact that you were a child actor and you left that to go to Harvard and do math and computer, and then you were saying you did a market, like an ad tech agency, and then you left that to go to law school. And so it's sort of I don't know, like, do you look at it as it's a muscle that you build up, when you kind of see, like, you listen more to your intuition about what you want to do rather than what everybody else thinks you should be doing, or you take these risks? Do you think it's something that you can build confidence in doing, and that sort of helped you in this last one?
Absolutely, no doubt. Yes. I think that's a phenomenal insight. And yeah. And to me, the muscle building process that you described, like, that's me living my life the way I want to live my life, because that's who I am.
Yeah. I mean, I have that same experience. I think I didn't take any risk really in my life until I left law. I think I always kind of followed that path, and it was the scariest thing to do. But it's funny that once I did it and I realized that all those fears that I made up were just untrue. And
yes,
it now seems so much like every other risk I take, I'm like, that's not that big of a deal, because it just it changes your perspective. And I think the more you do it, the easier it just becomes.
I think that's true.
And I saw on your website now that you've also started a different company now that is, again, another like digital marketing agency, right?
Yes. No, well, sort of close enough. So towards the beginning of this year, I launched a blockchain technology company. In concert with some partners, we're building the next generation sort of architecture for digital marketing.
I
know that sounds
incredible.
Super exciting.
No, it does.
I'm excited.
Yeah. Actually, I love it does sound exciting to me. And again, one of the things that I really wanted to point out when I started this podcast is I think a lot of times we feel like we have to pick a lane, and then that's what we do. I'm a lawyer, or I'm a doctor, or I do this and whatnot. And one of the things that I was really enamored by when I started getting a little bit more involved in like the tech community and whatnot is seeing people do so many different things in different areas that have nothing to do with each other, and realizing like, oh, it's a possibility to follow different interests. And I think that you're a prime example of that, is all of the different things. It's not like you started a construction company and then now you're starting another ancillary company that has something to do with construction. You're starting something else that is of interest to you. And that's perfectly fine. I think I really want people to understand that you can try things in different areas. You're not pigeonholed to one thing.
Yes. And I think we too often get distracted by this search for the right answer.
Right.
Without realizing that all that matters is your answer, and there is no right answer.
Yes, absolutely.
And some good answer is better than no answer at all. It does not have to be a perfect answer.
Right. Absolutely. And like just taking action. I feel like the clarity comes after you take action. You start taking action, and things become a little more clear than just conceptualizing.
Well, this is the whole like lash yourself to the masts idea,
right.
Or whatever. Burn the ships as soon as you land, kind of.
Right. And so you talk about in your book that living eyes wide open for you and just for everybody, it's a constant like practice that you have to do. And so how can people do things to help themselves build that muscle?
Okay, so, for me, it really ultimately begins with this sort of fundamental, total, complete accountability to yourself. Like if you can really convince yourself, or let me help you become convinced that it is truly the case that we are creating the lives we experience in all ways that matter and that are important. Once you buy that, the rest is details, but it really boils down to sort of being zealously committed to being aware of how you are consciously shaping that reality. It's a workout, right? It's a mental workout. It takes effort. It takes energy. It's something that I work at every day. There's times when I'm lousy at it because I'm human, but this is the way for me that I have decided to live my life. Again, it's brought me immeasurable joy and fulfillment, and I'd love to share it with anyone who's interested.
Yeah, and I will definitely link to your website for people that want to find out more information about your TED Talk, your book, and all the wonderful things that you're doing. Is there any other maybe resource or book or anything that you would recommend to someone that feels really stuck and they don't like what they're doing and they just really don't know where to turn? Like anything, whether it be inspiration or practical steps that they could take?
Viktor Frankl wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning. It is a book I have read a few times in my life, different sort of moments of reflection. Mm-hmm. I highly recommend it.
Great. I will link to that as well. Isaac, I can't thank you enough. It was such an honor to talk to you. I think that you are a shining example for all of us and how we should live our life. And I hope everyone really does take this to heart and go read your book because it is so insightful. And it just, I feel like the whole time I was like yelling like, yes, exactly. Yes. Like you just so succinctly put it. So thank you for that.
I really appreciate it. That means a lot to me. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening. I can't tell you how much it means to me. If you liked the podcast, please rate and review us on iTunes. It'll help other people find the show. If you want to connect or reach out, follow along on Instagram and Facebook at Lessons from a Quitter and on Twitter at Quitter Podcast. I would love to hear from you guys, and I'll see you on the next episode.